This story takes place in a small coastal town on the Cape Ann Peninsula in the northeastern corner of Massachusetts. Originally an uninhabited part of Gloucester in the 1600s, it was eventually referred to as Sandy Bay, a small port used to transport lumber for shipbuilding and Gloucester's fifth parish. In the 1800s, the first granite quarries were established by Old English Yankees and Irish stonemasons. The industry enticed enough hardscrabble folks to organize their own settlement. They called it Rockport. During the Industrial Revolution, durable, hard granite cut from Rockport quarries became highly coveted. Countless tons of this precious natural material was shipped across the eastern seaboard, placing the newfound town on the map. Granite was perfect for the high-end construction of early railroad and building foundations, bridges, jetties, gravestones, and paving blocks. It was also used in monumental government projects like the Brooklyn Bridge and U.S. Capitol building. At the peak of quarrying, Rockport had a large number of Swedish and Finnish immigrants with stoneworking expertise who made up the majority of the workforce. The first Scandinavians to arrive were the Swedes, who in the 1870s settled near Sheep's Pasture, a run near Pigeon Hill between the Steel Derrick and Bay State quarries. They were viewed by locals as pious and industrious. Men worked the stone while women served domestically. Swedish incomers acclimated as well as immigrants of their day could. It didn't hurt that they were the same shade as nearly all the other residents. Finns followed shortly thereafter, populating closer to the shore in and around Forest Street. Finn Alley, as it was called, was lined with shops, halls, and boarding rooms for quarry workers looking to bring their young families to America. Both groups of Scandinavians endured social isolation and economic hardship. They predominantly spoke their native languages and built their own churches and fraternal organizations. The Finns, who largely kept to themselves, had an especially hard time being accepted. Many were brought to quarries in the 1890s as strikebreakers who led a 4-month labor walkout against the Rockport Granite Company. Negotiations for fair treatment and a 9-hour workday were extremely contentious and sometimes violent. In the end, more than 2,000 quarrymen won, but at a cost. Finns were side-eyed by Yankee blue bloods, Irish old-timers, rich summer residents, well-heeled artists, even the Swedes. Truth be told, the Nordic neighbors have a very complicated history. In short, Finland was subjugated by Sweden from the Middle Ages until the early 19th century, when Sweden lost control of Finland to Russia during the Napoleonic Wars. Some of the parents and grandparents of those first Nordic granite workers most likely lived under the final days of Swedish rule. As fast as the granite industry grew, it faded. In the early 20th century, concrete became the standard material for construction. It was much cheaper, far easier to transport, and quick to cast. In the period between the two world wars, Rockport was on the ropes. Unlike the area's fishing industry, which soon exploded to make Gloucester the leading port in the United States, the granite industry, from which Rockport was built and defined, bottomed out. By the Great Depression, Rockport's population dropped nearly a quarter to 3,500, about where it was after the Civil War. The Great Depression and a loss of identity weren't the only things that put Rockport on edge. Classism and religious differences created palpable tensions across the town, and more importantly, within each ethnic group. When 2 unspeakable crimes were committed just months apart, the people of Rockport went into a quiet paranoia that lasted years. I'm Kory Curcuru for 1623 Studios, and this is the story of the Rockport Murder Mysteries. On the morning of Saturday, May 21st, 1932, there was a little bustle in Rockport. After a wet and chilly start to spring, temperatures were finally warming. A smattering of people of all ages strolled downtown. Many took advantage of the weekend weather, running errands before the Sabbath, when most stores would be closed. Inside Oker's tailor and haberdashery shop at 77 Main Street, owner Arthur Oker tended to customers. Featuring men's suits and accessories, Oker's store was a staple in the business sector for decades. Arthur's success was truly the realization of an immigrant's American dream. Oker and his wife Ida were ethnic Swedes who grew up on the southern coast of Finland. They and their children settled in Rockport in 1907. Their contributions to the community began immediately. Arthur worked as a tailor and Ida as a seamstress. It didn't take long for Arthur to establish a successful shop along Front Beach, just a short distance from their home. The Okers uniquely straddled both Scandinavian immigrant enclaves and acclimated to American culture more easily than their compatriots. Arthur, for example, spoke fluent Swedish, Finnish, and English. Unlike most of their neighbors, the Okers comfortably reached America's middle class. Shortly after they settled, the Okers joined the Swedish Congregational Church on Granite Street, one of 3 Swedish houses of worship in town, each a separate denomination. Organizationally, Swedish churches clashed over doctrine, and personally, class division amongst the Swedes led to discomfort. The Congregational Church that the Okers belonged to was the most evangelical of the 3. Ida helped lead the Ladies' Aid Society, the church's charitable women's group, and Arthur leapt to prominence, becoming a deacon, Sunday school teacher, and financial secretary. By the spring of 1932, 57-year-old Arthur was the long-standing church president. A man of routine, Arthur always opened around 8 a.m. and prepared for a morning of fittings, sales, and pickup orders. The store was impeccably maintained. There were clothing racks, display signs, and tasteful furniture that funneled towards a long checkout counter. Arthur did his tailoring and ironing in the back room, which had a window facing Front Beach and a separate entrance that led to a small yard. 2 large storefront windows featured items for sale. Each day before noon, Arthur rolled down the fabric shade to the front door, locked up, and made the short walk home to have lunch with Ida. On this fateful day, Arthur dealt with a handful of customers throughout the morning. Around 10 a.m., the phone rang simultaneously at the store as well as the Oker household, which shared the same number. Ida picked up the receiver and heard Arthur already in conversation, but it was in English, which she didn't understand well, so she quickly hung up. At 11:20, postman Ralph Wilson dropped off an insured, registered parcel. It was 18 inches square, a few inches deep, and light, consistent with a bolt of cloth. Wilson noticed 2 men in the shop. One was trying on a suit. He was red-headed and looked like a Swede. The other was seated. Wilson thought both could have been sailors from the way they dressed. He didn't think much of either, and couldn't give solid descriptions. Once Oker signed for the package, Postman Wilson left. Just before noon, Ida called Arthur to have him stop at the A&P next door for a few groceries. He didn't answer. Samuel Henderson, Arthur's landlord, visited but found the door locked. He thought nothing of it because he knew Arthur's daily routine. Ida called again. No answer. Another customer tried the door, heard nothing inside, and left. Ida called twice more by 12:15 to no avail. Arthur was never late. Ida sent her son, Rudolph, a 21-year-old chauffeur living at home, to get lunch fixings and check on his father. The Okers lived a little more than a football field away, barely a 5-minute walk. It was nearly 12:30 now. The town jailkeeper, Andrew Stevens, promised Oker he'd stop in to buy a shirt and tie. The door was locked, so he peeked inside the windows. It was dark, but he noticed Oker with his hands on the counter in conversation with a man in a light brown suit or topcoat and a straw hat. Stevens left to hop on the 12:30 bus to Gloucester. If he missed it, not all was lost, because he could easily make the next trip out of Rockport, which was the 1 o'clock train to Boston. A few minutes later, son Rudolph arrived. He saw the drawn shade and tried the locked door before glancing up and down Main Street looking for his father. He got groceries, then returned to the shop. Still unable to enter, Rudolph ran home to grab a duplicate key. He was worried that Arthur had fallen ill, which had happened in the past. On his jog back to the store, he hastily greeted Eben Green, a neighbor returning from the post office. Rudolph turned the key and went inside. Eben Green hadn't walked 50 yards before Rudolph stormed outside screaming for help. Green ran in and phoned the police. Landlord Henderson followed behind and yelled to call a doctor. When the first patrolman arrived, Rudolph was behind the counter, frantically nursing Arthur. He was unconscious and lying face down in an expanding pool of blood. The back of his head was caved in. Both pinky fingers were nearly severed. He was barely breathing. A local doctor rushed in, as did officers from Rockport and Gloucester, to transport Arthur by ambulance to Gloucester's Addison Gilbert Hospital. It was too late. Around 1 o'clock, before the ambulance reached the hospital, Arthur Oker succumbed to his wounds. His was the first murder in Rockport in over 50 years. Murder investigations in Massachusetts are handled by the County District Attorney's Office, the State Police, and the local police department where the crime was committed. Back then, the tiny Rockport force had only 4 full-time officers, led by longtime Police Chief John Sullivan. So the investigation of Arthur Oker's murder would be led by the Essex County DA, whose office included 2 assistants and 2 assigned state police detectives. John Sullivan was the law in Rockport. Now in his 70s, he began his career in law enforcement in the 1890s, at the height of the granite workers' labor chaos. He was serving his 42nd consecutive year as an officer in one capacity or another, but mostly as police chief. He was an institution unto himself, a small-town powerhouse who, depending on the situation, could be caring and accommodating or rough and tumble. This would be his first murder case. Chief Sullivan went to the hospital to view Arthur's body, then returned to Oker's shop. Sullivan's officers were already on hand, interfering with the crime scene, whether they realized it or not. The chief called the state police and the district attorney's office, then conducted his first sweep of the interior. There was no one hidden on the premises and no sign of forced entry. State Police Detective William Murray soon arrived. The official investigation began by questioning Rudolph and other nearby witnesses. One bystander across from Oker's shop said she saw a tall man in a brown topcoat and straw hat leaving with his head bowed just after 12:30 p.m. Rudolph was allowed to go home and break the news to his mother and sister, as well as 2 brothers who lived afar. The crime scene was as befuddling as the crime. The front door was locked from the inside. Its fabric roller shade was pulled down forcefully, torn slightly, then jammed into the door top to hold it in place. Officers checked the back room. The windowsills were covered in dust, so the killer must have exited through the front door, resetting the spring lock behind him. The main area of the store was a mess. Arthur's ironing board and burlap screen were toppled. Clothes and crumpled wax paper were strewn about. Blood was splattered all over the merchandise, walls, furniture, and clothing racks. A large puddle of blood coagulated by Arthur's sewing machine. From his wounds, it appeared Oker was attacked from behind, stumbled throughout the room, toppling things over, and ducked for cover behind the counter, only to be hit several times with a heavy, sharp object. Arthur's pinkies were nearly severed, most likely from defending himself. There were blood smears all over the countertop. The parcel that Postman Wilson delivered that morning was missing. Behind the counter was a small safe that was open about an inch. The interior of the door and the floor of the safe contained blood. Inside, there was an unbloodied hammer, like a tack hammer, that was far too small to be the murder weapon. Next to it lay a lottery ticket stub. Lastly, a clump of black and gray hair was stuck to a corner, but Oker's hair was neither black nor gray. Near the safe on the floor was an oblong box with a tiny amount of change in it. Oker's pockets were turned out. His billfold, as well as the keys to his car and store, were all missing. Arthur had only a few customers that morning, so he couldn't have been holding much cash. He did work as a collection agent for the Gloucester Coal and Lumber Company, and ironed clothes on the side too, but he probably didn't have much on him, not that early on a Saturday. The rest of the afternoon was chaotic. The district attorney ordered an immediate autopsy at the Burgess Funeral Home. Oker's face was unmarked, but his left eye and ear were discolored. His right eye was shut. He suffered several cuts on the top front part of his head. The back of his skull was crushed with open holes in the cranium. Arthur's tailor's shears were missing, but his wounds looked more like he was attacked with a hammer or a hatchet. Lastly, A needle had pierced the palm of his right hand. It was estimated that Arthur may have survived 30 minutes at most, timestamping the murder around 12:30 p.m. By nightfall, a large, curious crowd gathered outside Oker's tailor and haberdashery shop and trailed towards the police station at Dock Square. The Essex County DA was Hugh Craig, who had served as a state rep for the region before winning this post just 2 years before. Craig's career in law enforcement was just getting started, but he was a well-known name in political circles. As DA, Craig could summon specialists like photographers and fingerprints experts, as well as state troopers for cases such as Arthur Oker's, which he did. With Rockporters appalled and paralyzed, the state investigation quickly became intense and personal. The morning after the murder, Rudolph guided detectives through the store as it was dusted for fingerprints. A police photographer captured all he could. Then the questions started coming. How did no one see or hear anything in the middle of a beautiful Saturday in the busiest part of town? What was the murder weapon, and where was it? Did Oker have enemies? Was he in financial trouble? Who was a straw-hatted man? What about the lottery ticket? And while we're at it, the local jailkeeper and Arthur's own son both tried the door and looked inside the windows within moments of the murder, a lengthy, violent confrontation, and neither saw or heard any commotion. Then the murderer, who splattered Arthur's blood all over the shop, casually walked out the front door and onto Main Street, next to the grocery store and post office, left no trail, and was only seen, allegedly, by one lady across the street. Was this the luckiest getaway ever? While Rockport police officers pored over records of residents with criminal backgrounds, detectives conducted interviews amongst customers, shopkeepers, and downtown residents at the police station. Authorities first believed it was a robbery, estimating that Arthur had perhaps $25 in his pockets, which were turned inside out, and kept in his billfold, which was missing. But he never kept money in the safe. In fact, he didn't even lock it. The lottery stub was perplexing. Lotteries were illegal in Massachusetts then, but underground games proliferated during the Depression. Oker's ticket was vague and couldn't be traced, though a rumor circulated that he won $1,100 the week before, the equivalent to $24,000 today. However, Arthur's family swore that they never knew him to gamble, play the lottery, or ever take financial risks. As authorities learned more about Arthur and his habits, they grew less confident it was a robbery. Oker was frugal, never flashy, and quiet. He was known to have always extended credit to customers, sometimes hundreds of dollars worth, yet was never forceful about collecting debts. There were also no bank records showing that Oker had ever made any large deposits. Oker was said to have had no enemies or issues, but word of a possible love triangle arose, as did gossipy rumors of his daughter's love life. None of it was substantiated. The lotto and the love lives weren't the only rumors floating around. Newspapers glommed onto the story, filling columns with tantalizing articles for the morning and evening editions. The Great Depression saw a sharp rise in tabloid or jazz journalism, and reporters and law enforcement had a weird symbiotic relationship. The press always wanted inside information and early access to crime scenes. The police needed positive coverage and public support, but they also relied on newspapers to appeal for witnesses, spread word of wanted criminals, and generate interest that could lead to tips. But some rumors had legs. Police caught wind that Arthur may have sold outdated merchandise to a Boston man for $1,000, but didn't give the man who arranged the deal a commission. The middleman insisted on getting Oker's phone number. But when police tracked the man down, they noted that he was angry, but not murderously angry. Moving on. Investigators believed the suspect knew Arthur. He was in the store at 10:30 and stayed until customers left. He knew the store layout and noticed that the windows were obscured by items on display. He was even seen having a private conversation with Oker. Police reimagined the crime. After the first blow, the suspect followed Oker around the store, beating him. Arthur's severed pinkies indicated that he vainly tried blocking the blows. When he collapsed behind the counter, the suspect rifled through the safe and Arthur's pockets to throw authorities off the real motive. Then he walked out the front door. At this point, Authorities believe that the murder weapon was Arthur's tailor's shears, which were built much heavier in those days to cut through the popular, thicker fabrics of that era, like velvet and wool. Chief Sullivan and his team scoured Front Beach and nearby premises. Newspapermen canvassed Mill Pond and Back Beach. At the end of the day, detectives concluded their investigation of the crime scene and turned the store back over to the Oker family. Three days after his murder, a service was held for Arthur at the Swedish Congregational Church. It was unseasonably warm. The traditional hymns sung by the choir carried outdoors. It was the height of the Depression, when few people owned cars, yet hundreds of vehicles lined the streets. The Boston Herald reported that it was the largest funeral in Rockport's history. Arthur was laid to rest at Beech Grove Cemetery. Throughout the services, Chief Sullivan, Detective Murray, and 2 police officers carefully studied the mourners. In the immediate days that followed, authorities scrambled to find a motive, a murder weapon, and a killer. Chief Sullivan offered full protection to anyone with information that would lead to an arrest. The usual suspects of the day were sailors and railroad riders. Sailors were always passing through the docks, and Rockport was a popular terminus for the Boston and Maine Railroad. Many were questioned, but none were found at fault. When rumors of an imminent arrest arose, and there were plenty of rumors, locals buzzed around the police station in hopes of seeing the murderer. The prevailing belief was that the killer was local. In the meantime, laundries looked for clothes with blood stains. Postal clerks reviewed handwritten logbooks to identify the sender and contents of Arthur's empty parcel. Tracing the phone call that Ida overheard that morning was wishful but impossible. All Rockporters had rotary dial phones, meaning that calls didn't go through operators. A couple soft clues trickled in. A medium-complexioned man in a topcoat and felt hat was reportedly seen on a bus earlier that morning. One witness spotted a fishy, cream-colored coupe with its rumble seat up, but the license plate number she swore she remembered began with 727. The registry had yet to issue numbers that high. Speaking of getaway cars, it should be noted that in 1932, before the Apia Andrew Bridge was built to span the Annisquam River, that's the Route 128 highway bridge, the only exit point by car was across the Blimmen Drawbridge on Gloucester's Stacy Boulevard. Gloucester police were often stationed there, but not at noontime on Saturdays. If a getaway car was unsuspecting and played it cool, it got away. Then, less than a week after the murder, a more substantial story hit. 2 men in a dark blue coupe were arrested on a moving violation in Wrentham, near the Rhode Island border. The driver, Jerome McKenna, was from Springfield, Illinois. The passenger, T.M. Connolly, from Providence. They claimed they were silver salesmen and had borrowed the car from Essex resident Leroy Jensen on May 21st, the day Arthur Oker was killed. Jensen corroborated that 2 men approached him at a restaurant a week earlier, saying their car broke down en route to visiting potential clients, so he lent them his car. Wrentham police advised McKenna and Connolly to clear their names in Rockport. They drove up the coast and met Chief Sullivan at the station. After questioning, Sullivan cleared the 2, but ordered them to meet Detective Murray at Rockport Town Hall the following morning. They didn't show. Later that night, though, Rockport police found McKenna in a Gloucester hotel, placed him in protective custody, then grilled him. McKenna and Connolly were eventually cleared, and Jensen got his car back. After 1 week, the investigation yielded no news, no progress, and no arrest. The DA's office, local police, and state detectives all had differing theories that seemed to change by the hour. Dissatisfied townies considered offering their own reward, since the police couldn't post one without the approval of the Rockport selectmen, who had yet to meet since the murder. Other arrests around the North Shore led to speculation about connections to Oker's murder. Someone wearing a sailor suit was arrested in Amesbury, for example, but there were no meaningful ties. Law enforcement didn't exactly instill confidence in the community. One day, detectives, Rockport police, and District Attorney Craig pronounced the killer was a local. The next day, they said that Arthur knew the killer well, but the killer wasn't from Rockport. Craig ordered his detectives to compile the names of all of Arthur's associates, clients, friends, and the entire assembly of the Swedish Congregational Church. One name jumped out. Carl David Eriksson was a former minister of Oker's church. Born in Sweden, he was hired by the church in 1929. Arthur emceed Eriksson's welcome reception. In fact, Eriksson stayed at the Oker home. But something must have happened, because Eriksson was ousted merely 18 months later, about a year before Arthur's death, while Oker served on the board. Was it acrimonious? In either case, Eriksson hadn't been seen or heard from since his departure. Nevertheless, the NYPD was asked to look into the records of 2 huge Swedish passenger ships that recently departed from New York for Sweden. One left a month before the murder, the other a week after. The question was, were there any Carl David Erikssons on board? Which was like asking if there were any John Smiths in the phone book. There were 10. If by chance Carl had been around Rockport again, he either had the perfect alibi or was long gone. Spring turned into summer. Arthur's family began to realize life without him. To help settle his estate, the Okers ran ads in the Gloucester Daily Times featuring drastically reduced prices on all store merchandise. Rudolph continued the family business alongside his brother-in-law, tugboat captain Roger Martin. The prospect of finding the murderer grew more bleak. Police still hadn't found the murder weapon. They weren't even sure what they were looking for. There were no reliable witnesses, and with Arthur's squeaky clean reputation, no conceivable motive. The Oker case was at a standstill. By the end of June, 40 days after the crime, state detectives stopped making regular calls to the Rockport police. The town was teetering. The DA's office was getting heat, and then things got really testy. After a report of a fight on Back Beach, police arrested Selectman Ralph Parker for drunk driving, which led to a $200 fine and a court date. Then, just in time for Christmas, Parker wrote a scathing op-ed in the Gloucester Times accusing Chief Sullivan of leaving Oker's shop unlocked during the afternoon of the murder, allowing curious people to enter the crime scene and destroy evidence. The remainder of 1932 proved just as dreary. Rockporters believed a maniac was on the loose. They were unnerved. Their public officials were sparring over allegations of a botched investigation, and the county DA was struggling to rebuild his reputation. More than a year peeled off the calendar without any breaks in the case. Arthur's shop remained open, the Swedish Congregational Church carried on with a new president, and Ida Oker remained involved as a deaconess and key contributor to the Ladies' Aid Society. But life was very different. The chill of autumn crept in over a tired quarry town steeped in sadness. And then, just as Rockport was beginning to get a little distance from the murder of a beloved neighbor, it happened again, on Halloween night. The horrifying event would lead to the biggest manhunt in state history. And this time, everyone with a home address in Rockport was a suspect.